of the research. I am a private practice dietitian, and I do consult for addiction treatment centers here in Los Angeles. I will disclose any affiliations that I have as we go through. And I also want to state that we are talking about leptin, ghrelin, and insulin today. And those are the three hormones of concern for the sake of this presentation, but there are so many others, including cortisol, neuropeptide, YY, CCK that we're not getting into. So this really is just scratching the surface. So today we're going to link addiction and nutrition. We are going to explore addiction as it relates to both drugs and alcohol and highly palatable food. As mentioned, we're going to look at leptin, ghrelin, and insulin, and I'll make some recommendations for recovery. So quick background, we do know that addictions, also known as substance use disorders, are associated with significant vitamin and mineral deficiencies. This has been well documented in the last several decades. But the new question that's surfacing is, okay, well, what about neurocircuitry? What about brain chemistry? What about nutrition-related hormones? And that's what we're going to discuss today. We know that addiction is associated with malnutrition. First and foremost, primary malnutrition when the person isn't eating, poor intake. Secondary malnutrition can occur, though, when there's alterations in the way that nutrients are absorbed, metabolized, utilized, and excreted. An obvious example would be thiamine deficiency in alcoholism. These secondary malnutrition can come as a result of compromised health with respect to GI, metabolic, neurological. These are things that we're going to actually get into today. All types of malnutrition will decrease the immune system function and lead to an inadequate response to disease. Now, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics did release a position paper in 1990 that supported the need for nutrition intervention in treatment and recovery from addiction. The paper stated that RDs are essential members of the treatment team and that nutrition care should be integrated into the protocol rather than simply patched on. Nutrition professionals were urged to take aggressive action to ensure involvement in treatment and recovery programs, and that is something that I have certainly done. However, in my research, I found out that this actual position paper was not renewed. So in 1995, it did not get renewed. There has been very little progress incorporating dietitians into rehab programs, despite this continued explosion of drug abuse. There's several possible reasons why. Certainly there's difficulties conducting research on this population. I've seen a general lack of interest from RDs, the stigmas related to addiction. It's a big private sector industry, and there's certainly some non-collaboration between public and private, and it all leads to limited funding for new initiatives, limited data, and limited access to dietitians. There was a study that I did find all the way back into the 50s where Dr. Verzar proposed that a problem being addiction that is mainly psychological might be solved by better nutrition. So this isn't a brand new concept. He actually looked at the relationship between coca leaves chewing and the inhibition of hunger. So the concept isn't new, but we've been developing it over the last many years. Quick background. This is a hot topic. I would assume many of us have even seen this image, the PET scan imaging that looks at similarities between cocaine addicts and obese individuals related to dopamine deficiency in the brain. We're looking at the VTA portion of the brain, which we will discuss. So we're looking at characteristics in brain imaging and also characteristics in behavior between drug addicts and compulsive overeaters. We're going to talk a lot today about reward. And when we talk about reward, we're talking about dopamine. And it can come from drugs, alcohol. It can come from highly hedonic, highly palatable food, which for our case, we're going to consider processed foods with added sugar, salts, and fat. So as stated, dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's the major brain chemical involved in addiction. It's important in movement, motivation, attention. What we're going to discuss today is this concept of reward and well-being. I always think of dopamine as being related to pleasure, but there's a lot more that it does. Like I stated, motivation and attention can lead to reward seeking. An individual with Parkinson's that cannot hold their hand that is shaking has a dopamine deficiency. So that portion of the brain that was lit up in the previous slide is known as the ventral tegmental area. This contains dopamine neurons that project to corticolimbic structures such as the nucleus accumbens, which is the pleasure center, which we'll talk about, the medial prefrontal cortex in general, weighs pros and cons, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and this portion of the brain does receive direct input from the hypothalamus, which is not necessarily considered the VTA. It is the appetite center in the brain, and it does govern several endocrine processes, which we're going to discuss today. So addictive substances, we know alcohol, drugs, nicotine, caffeine, and now we're looking at what about food? And food's not addicting for all people, but we're seeing that it has addictive processes for some. The main foods that have been shown to be problematic include refined grains, which become sugar rapidly, refined sugars, artificial sweeteners, added salts, added fats. And it's not just those particular constituents of food, but it's the way that they're combined, the dynamic contrast. So the Academy has taken a position on this food addiction concept. The position statement is known as the total diet approach, which rejects labeling foods as good and bad because it's believed to foster unhealthy eating behaviors. And while I think that is a strong message for the general public, certainly a strong message for many eating disorder populations that have black and white thinking, certainly a message of recovery, you know, but for certain circumstances, this message, you know, can be very confusing to some people. The Academy has stated that sugar addiction present in human beings has not been proven, and this is the source of a lot of controversy because there is certainly a lot of data out there that supports it. So we also know this term process addiction, which isn't necessarily referring to substances, but more referring to processes like gambling, internet, pornography, sex, crime. Eating is categorized as a process addiction, but now the question is, well, is eating a process addiction or is it a substance-related addiction? In other words, is overeating behavioral or is it substance? Is it the person or is it the food? If it is the food, should people abstain from eating certain foods if they're addicted to them? Or, right, is that attempt to abstain from certain foods going to lead to rebound binging? So this is a hot controversy in the field. I go to conferences, I talk binge eating disorder, I talk food addiction, and there really is no general consensus. In classic eating disorder treatment, there is no abstaining from specific foods, more so abstaining from offending behaviors. But I will say that the evidence supporting food addiction is very robust and increasingly strong. So when we discuss food addiction, we're talking about endorphins that are released after consuming food. We're looking at dopamine activity in the brain, and it's not just the brain, it's a communication system between the gut and the brain. There's a cranial nerve known as the vagus nerve, which helps communicate this information. So we're looking at dopamine circuitry as being the site of convergence between metabolic and hormonal information that essentially regulates eating behavior. So this concept of eating behavior or behavioral health is much more complicated and complex than once imagined. It's not just about calories and portion sizes and making food choices. There's a complex network of brain chemistry, stomach chemistry, hormone chemistry that creates certainly some challenges for many people to regulate their food intake. So when we look at this concept of regulating food intake, it's not just calories, it's reinforcement, palatability, which is related to brain circuitry. There's also cues that play a big role. We're looking at psychological cues, social cues, and there's also cognition, right? Looking at the prefrontal cortex, which is our ability to make informed decisions. So seeing these two diagrams, we do highlight how complicated this actual topic is. It's not just food, it's stomach, it's brain, it's hormones. And the hormones we're going to talk about today are leptin, ghrelin, and insulin. This is a very hot topic, as I mentioned, the co-occurrence of eating disorder and substance use disorder. The overlapping neural circuitry has highlighted important similarities in these. As someone that is in practice, I see people go from addiction and then get sober and go into an eating disorder and vice versa. So we're looking at how similar these disorders are. I just listed combinations that I see in my practice. The type of work that I do primarily is looking at the combination of binge eating disorder and substance use disorder and vice versa. There is now a book that's just come out that actually does summarize all the different research related to eating disorders, addictions, and substance use disorders. It's been a long work in progress, and I will say I was fortunate to contribute 2 chapters to this book. So just one point to clarify before we move on. This health burden that we're seeing arising from drug addiction is not just in the direct effects of intoxication, but in the secondary effects on physical health. So we're seeing that drug addicts are overly represented in the healthcare system, contributing to significant burden related to type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease. And given that weight gain following abstinence from drugs is a source of major personal suffering, there's a pressing need for a more detailed understanding on the effects of drug addiction on dietary intake. So consider this a call to order for any dietitians that are interested in this topic. So just a quick definition of addiction. As mentioned, the DSM-5 uses the term substance use disorder. It doesn't use the word addiction. It uses addictive related disorders. But the American Society of Addiction Medicine has a basic definition calling addiction a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry, which is what we looked at when we looked at that image of the brain. So ASAM does recognize food as having addictive potential. Quick definition of food from Wiki is that it's any nutritious substance that people or animals eat or drink, or that plants absorb in order to maintain life and growth. So what I want to state, based on the research that I've done and people that I've worked with, is that food in its natural state is hardly addictive, right? It's not food that's addictive. We're actually going to look at these highly concentrated byproducts of food, also known as processed food. Quick look at the coca leaf in its natural state. It's not highly addictive. People chew it, but they can take it alone, take it or leave it alone. Once it gets processed, it gets very much concentrated into a powder. This powder is a byproduct of the original plant. That becomes addictive. And then what man can do is process it even further to make crack cocaine, which certainly is highly addictive and wreaks havoc. Same thing similar with the poppy plant, not highly addictive as a plant. Opium can be extracted, which forms an addictive substance. And then we're looking at heroin, which is concentrated even further, which we all know destroys human life. So we're looking at a similar thing with plants and food, whereas a basic wheat plant doesn't have addictive potential. But once we process it and create concentrated byproducts like wheat flour, some people find it to be offensive, but once processed and concentrated even further, we're looking at refined white flour, which people are reporting issues related to their eating behavior. Same thing with corn, becoming corn syrup, becoming high fructose corn syrup. We can do the same thing with the sugar cane. And so the point that I want to make is that it's not that food is addicting, it's that the highly concentrated byproducts of food are being shown to be problematic for people. There was a tool developed in Yale in 2008, it's been validated. It's called the Yale Food Addiction Scale. It documents abnormal desires for sweet, salty, and fatty foods. They did use the DSM-4 criteria for substance dependence, criteria such as withdrawal, tolerance, and use despite negative consequences. They have found in research that food addiction criteria was met for over half of obese binge eating disorder patients. And I've been taking a close look at some of the similarities and differences between food addiction and obese binge eating patients. And one of the conclusions that I've come to is that for classic BED, it's for many cases not so much about the food. You can treat a classic BED patient with addressing a lot of the underlying issues, whereas a food addict, it is about the food. They become addicted to highly palatable processed food, and it isn't so much about the underlying issues, it's about creating behavior change. Now, what's interesting, as stated in the study, is that most people have both. And that's what I'm seeing most frequently in my practice, trying to deal with the binge eating patient who has food addiction. So just a quick snapshot at some of the drug data that's out there. Many people who are using drugs, in a nutshell, eat junk food, eat food that's not classifiable into the food group system. There's a preference for easily ingested, easily digested foods like cereal and milk, ice cream. There's difficulty with raw vegetables, meat. So in a nutshell, drugs and alcohol certainly create digestive issues and create a strong preference for foods that are rich in sugar, salt, and fat. Another large sample study looking at drug addicts in Norway found that they preferred sugar-sweetened foods more so than the average. Many of them had significant vitamin and mineral deficiencies. So now moving on to leptin and starting to look at the link with some of these hormones. Leptin is produced and secreted by adipose tissue. It's certainly associated with fat mass. In other words, people that have higher fat mass will have higher plasma leptin. Leptin is known to increase the metabolic rate and then will consequently initiate the starvation response or decrease food intake. So one study showed that the reward value of sucrose was decreased by leptin by way of reduction in dopamine signaling. In other words, low levels of leptin lead to a higher reward value of food. If leptin is low, it will create more dopaminergic reward related to food because the body will perceive a hungry state and will enhance its motivation for food. When we talked about dopamine, we talked about its connection to motivation. So when someone is satiated, the dopamine release and firing is actually inhibited in the nucleus accumbens. And very, very interestingly, what we're seeing is that while low levels lead to higher reward value of food, high levels have no pronounced effect on metabolism and feeding. More on that in a moment. So we know that leptin regulates the homeostatic center of the hypothalamus. So there's a communication system that basically affects an individual's subjective desires for food, how much they, how hungry one might be, how rewarding they might perceive a pepperoni pizza to be. We know that food deprivation will decrease circulating leptin. Okay, so not eating will decrease leptin and will increase preference for highly palatable foods. So there's a communication system between dopamine and leptin. It's known as the leptin-dopamine interaction, and it's bidirectional. In other words, they communicate with one another to regulate feeding behavior. Now, very interestingly, obesity is linked to a high plasma leptin, but it's also linked to a decreased energy expenditure and an increased energy intake. So this is the question that we're posing and researchers are exploring. Why doesn't elevated leptin control or reverse obesity? In other words, if individuals that have larger amounts of adipose tissue have high leptin, why doesn't it do what it's supposed to do? And there have been authors that have proposed the concept of leptin resistance, where the leptin is there and is not working, similar to insulin. There's a new term called hypothalamic leptin insufficiency, and these are both theories which describe why leptin isn't doing what it's supposed to do in obese individuals. And I actually will touch on that more so in a few slides. But what we do know for sure is that this homeostatic feedback mechanism between leptin and the reward system in the brain is impaired. In other words, there's some poor communication going on and something ain't working right. As you can see from the diagram here, we're looking at leptin levels in a normal person, lower than an obese person, and this is at states of being full and being hungry. So ghrelin is opposite of leptin. It is countered by leptin. Ghrelin is also known as the hunger hormone. It stimulates appetite and will decrease after eating. Ghrelin is derived in the stomach. However, there are ghrelin receptors that have been identified in the VTA, the hippocampus, and the amygdala, we know that the sight of food elevates ghrelin. So just looking at food can create a physiological response where this hormone starts to increase and prepare for the feeding. Obese subjects had low ghrelin, however, after the meal, their ghrelin remained higher. So it's very similar to the leptin slide. There's something impaired in certain obese subjects where the ghrelin was still high after the meal. In other words, they were still hungry. They weren't getting a true fullness cue, in other words. There's been some rat research which has shown that injecting ghrelin into the VTA, into the nucleus accumbens, increases feeding behavior, which makes perfect sense based on what we know is the direct target site for ghrelin's action on sweet food motivation or sucrose. And there was one really interesting study that showed that ghrelin enhances sweet taste, food consumption, and preference regardless of its caloric content. In other words, even an artificial sweetener did the job. So ghrelin alters the set point of dopaminergic neurons. Just like leptin, it communicates with dopamine in the brain. Individuals can start to expect a meal. In other words, if you eat every day at 5:30, there can be some physiological expectations at 5 o'clock as it's approaching mealtime that are documented by ghrelin. We know that ghrelin is linked to opioid receptor pathways, which will essentially regulate food incentive and hedonics, which is related to the reward system, and that ghrelin will affect motivational effects on feeding. Insulin is similar to leptin in many ways. We know that, well, first of all, it's different in that it's a peptide hormone from the pancreas. It helps get glucose into the cell. But much like leptin, it is an adiposity signal, so it signals for fat storage. It's anorexigenic, which means it causes, it initiates a starvation response. It causes someone to stop eating. It will attenuate food reward when it's high, and when it's low, the drive for food intake will increase. So in other words, just like leptin, it communicates with dopamine to calibrate the reward that's associated with feeding. Insulin depresses dopamine concentrations in the VTA, which may suppress salience of food once satiety is reached. Now, this is an important point. I think this is one of the main points that I want to highlight. I actually heard Dr. Lustig speak on this topic, and I think this might have been what even inspired me to learn more about hormones as they relate to addiction, is that in a nutshell, because insulin and leptin are very similar, they compete with one another. Insulin receptor signaling pathway will actually interfere with leptin signaling. So insulin blocks leptin. So if insulin is very high, leptin can't really do what it's supposed to do. In other words, this might be an explanation for why high leptin levels doesn't reverse obesity. Because if insulin is constantly high, leptin can't work. So we know that hyperinsulinemia does contribute to the pathogenesis of leptin resistance. It essentially interferes with leptin's extinguishing of dopamine clearance in the nucleus accumbens, which is a primary characteristic of addiction. Similar to ghrelin, there's insulin receptors in the hypothalamus, the VTA, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. Secretion of insulin is decreased by ghrelin and vice versa. So again, insulin and leptin are very similar in the way that they interact with ghrelin. And you can see a little chart here about some of those effects. So now the question is, what role do hormones play in addiction? And if food affects hormones, what role does food play in addiction? Right? So just a quick look at insulin in addiction. This is a relatively recent study. Showed that the insulin influenced dopamine transmission can affect the ability of drugs to exert their neurochemical and behavioral effects, that there are insulin receptors that are present in the brain and the midbrain dopamine neurons, and that this interplay between insulin signaling and drug-induced increases in extracellular dopamine may be a contributor to the high comorbidity of eating disorders and drug abuse. So this is the source of some of the overlap that we're looking at between eating disorder and substance use disorders. It's being proposed that improvements in brain dopamine function by normalizing or bypassing disruptions in insulin signaling might be effective in treating addiction. And if you're a dietitian or you work as a nutritionist, it's possible that we can start to normalize insulin levels to help people overcoming their addiction. So this connection between alcohol and leptin is not very clear. I do want to move into looking at certain specific substances. Alcohol and leptin is not 100% clear because there's some significant differences between the short term and the long term. In the big picture, there's suppressed leptin secretion. However, chronic alcoholism has been linked to elevated circulating leptin. In other words, it's possible that the changes in the fat tissue of alcoholics cause the fat tissue to release more leptin, but it's not 100% sure. What we do know is that leptin will increase throughout alcohol withdrawal in females, and that there's some significant differences between males and females as it relates to leptin and as it relates to alcohol. So there have been some authors that have proposed that those differences may be a contributing factor to the fact that alcoholic men will outnumber alcoholic women roughly 4-to-1. Alcohol and ghrelin is a little more clear. We know that the rewarding properties of alcohol do require ghrelin. An alcoholic who is going through withdrawal will have increased ghrelin over time. It could be just changes in hunger. But we do know that anecdotally, we know that many people prefer an alcoholic beverage before a meal, which will stimulate appetite. And based on what we know about ghrelin, it can make sense why that would work. We know that ghrelin has a key role in alcohol-seeking behavior based on the dopamine neurobiology that we've discussed today, and that hyperghrelinemia is related to addiction. And based on what we know, there are authors that are proposing the question, okay, so maybe we're going to try using a ghrelin antagonist in the treatment of addictions. With respect to insulin, we know that sober alcoholics have shown blunted responses, possibly due to nervous system damage. In the first month of abstinence, they do perceive more pleasure from sweetness, which highlights the brain chemistry changes. This was first described in 1996 as reward deficiency syndrome. In other words, the dopamine in the brain is low from the chronic alcohol use, from the chronic drug use. So of course, if the dopamine is low, the introduction of sugar and highly palatable foods will be a very rewarding response and will be highly preferred and highly favored. For alcoholics, those who are abstinent at 6 months were less likely to prefer the maximum sweetness than those not sober. Moving on to crystal meth, we know that it's linked to eating disorders. We know that food restriction enhances the rewarding effect. So obviously, based on what we've discussed today, the changes in hormones and brain chemistry from not eating will create higher levels of reward. We know that ghrelin is required for reward from the whole family of amphetamines. And that hyperghrelinemia that's observable in drug addicts does raise important questions about ghrelin and meth. In cocaine, we're looking at PET scan imaging that highlights deficits in the dopamine signaling that's similar for both cocaine addicted and obese rats. So we talked about that early on in the presentation. Similarities in brain scans for drug addiction, cocaine addiction, and that humans prefer the highest preference of sucrose offered. Those are cocaine addicts. They want more sugar than a control. And what the sugar essentially does is reinforces those depleted reward pathways. Makes perfect sense based on what we know about brain chemistry. Ghrelin modulates the reinforcement and reward from cocaine. There was one study that looked at female crack users that showed low leptin in their early abstinence, which would be expected, and this increased during detox, which would also be expected. This study I found to be very significant. It actually looked at cocaine addicts, it looked at appetite, and it looked at leptin. So this is basically the topic of interest today. This study looked at cocaine-dependent men that were still using, they reported an increased food intake, specifically foods that were high in fat and high in carbohydrate. There was a trend towards lower levels of circulating leptin in that group, which directly interfered with their metabolic processes. In other words, they had low leptin with high preference for foods that were high in fat and carbohydrate, and that they were overeating. However, this effect was masked by their lack of weight gain. So a lot of times the overeating in these cocaine addicts predates their recovery. It wasn't just until they got sober that they started overeating. A lot of them are having a dysfunctional relationship to food while using. In other words, maybe they'll go a day or two without eating and then eat potentially subclinical binge or a true binge episode, but they're not gaining weight. So what this is doing is creating an imbalance between fat intake and storage, which certainly explains the excessive weight gain during recovery. So the low leptin mixed with the high preference for high fat, high carbohydrate foods, when you take that into early recovery, you're basically setting the person up for a disaster. And what I see in many cases is people gaining 20 pounds in the first month of sobriety. And one of the jobs that I do is I help people gain weight at a much slower rate based on this data. Opiates are associated with infrequent eating. Opiate addicts have little interest in food as a general rule. They have certainly a reduced gastric motility and emptying. There's impairments in their gastrin. So opiates, heroin, pharmaceuticals are associated with constipation while using. Certainly during detox, there can be diarrhea, constipation, GI discomfort that can lead for several months. And so there's a compromised gut health, which will impair absorption of amino acids and vitamins and minerals. Looking at some of the rat data, we found that food restriction does lead to heroin seeking in rats, right? And this makes perfect sense based on what we know about hunger hormones and brain chemistry. By infusing leptin, we found that there was a decreased activity in the VCA and the nucleus accumbens, which lessened heroin seeking in rats. So by increasing leptin, the rats sought less heroin. Looking at ghrelin, we know that it's likely more responsible than leptin for inducing increases in drug taking and drug seeking behaviors. However, this one study did show that treatment with the ghrelin receptor agonist had no effect on reinstatement of heroin seeking in rats. So there's a ton of rat data on this topic. Certainly, there's a need for more human data. Looking at methadone, it's obviously easier to get human data from methadone subjects because they're coming in for their treatment every day. Much easier to collect data. Methadone-treated patients did show a higher consumption of sweets, a higher eagerness to consume sweets, willingness to consume larger quantities desired by controls, and if anyone's interested in a qualitative study, heroin addicts have confirmed their dysfunctional eating behaviors. Quick look at some other hormones that I found to be interesting. Little side note, not necessarily on topic, but it was shown that there was osteopenia or osteoporosis in a relatively young sample of methadone addicts, and that it could be related to low luteinizing hormone, low estrogen, testosterone, impaired adrenal function. Basically what this study showed was that there's a need for more study on hormones and drug addiction. There was another study that showed basal leptin being significantly decreased, which makes sense. Here are some of the other hormones that we're not discussing in detail in this talk, but I want to encourage people to become experts on hormones. This will certainly be an increasingly hot topic. Certain authors have proposed that low serum leptin can be a contributor to immune dysfunction, and now there's authors proposing trials that involving gene therapy, reinstating leptin circuitry in drugs. So moving on, we're looking at the relationship between nutrition and addiction treatment. There's certainly disordered eating. We know that drug abuse is a risk factor for eating disorders. There's genetic influences, environmental influences. We're seeing an increased sugar use over time. In other words, people that had a preference for X amount of sugar at 9 months sober, they were consuming X squared. We know that alcohol is linked to binging and purging. We've seen women in addiction treatment showing binge eating disorder, bulimia, men in treatment also reporting binging, using food to satisfy cravings. Later on in recovery, more like 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, they're reporting weight concerns and distress about their efforts to lose weight. So binge eating disorder is still poorly understood. There's certainly debates about if it's a psychological issue or a biological issue. And I think that it's definitely both. But on the biological side, we're looking at now how is dopamine involved in regulating food motivation. Food motivation describes one's willingness to go to, for example, to drive 8 miles for something very specific that they want, whereas other people will just simply eat it if it's around. And the question is brain dopamine involved in this motivation for food consumption that we're seeing in binge eating patients? So quick discernment between the two. A binge eater might eat the whole box of chocolates in one sitting, whereas a food addict might eat the whole box over several sittings, might need one every single day. The binge eater has more emotional or spiritual disturbances. In other words, it's not about the food, where the food addict is having physiological responses to food that's being ingested, and so it is about the food. BED is recognized in the DSM-5, and I think starting in August, we're looking at insurance reimbursement, whereas food addiction is not recognized or reimbursable. But if you do use the substance use disorder criteria in the DSM-5, you can certainly see where food addiction is a very plausible concept. So there's certainly more similarities and differences, and obesity can exist without either one. Recovering drug addicts gain weight because when they're using, eating becomes elective, right? They can take it or leave it alone. But when getting sober, the hypothalamus wakes back up. It's been suppressed from the drug use, and the appetite and taste returns in the post-drug state, and the eating can actually be very ravenous. Individuals who are nearly sober do have that altered biochemistry. The dysfunctional eating behavior surfaces and then persists into recovery. For many people, making healthful food choices after abstinence is very challenging. Sobriety is associated with new emotions, anxiety, uncertainty. It's very easy to seek a predictable and comforting response from food. This can certainly lead to overeating, relapse, compromised quality of life, and chronic disease. Just a quick look at some of the data. I don't want to spend much time in this, but if you are looking for data that supports the role of nutrition intervention in addiction recovery, there have been reports of positive associations in the VA system. There's some international data from Italy that shows that educational interventions did increase reports of continued abstinence. This one study looked at a male population in New York. They provided evidence that educational and environmental interventions can be successful in these environments. There's data in the prison population from the UK. There's data from the prison population in the US. There's some industry leaders just looking at the big picture. Hazelden and Betty Ford actually recently merged. These are major addiction industry leaders. At Betty Ford, they do have treatment models that include measures to prevent post-detox overeating. They do hire dietitians. They emphasize exercise and help patients plan for these expected changes in eating. Breathe Life Healing Center is a new facility in Los Angeles that I do consult for, so there is a disclosure there. But they have actually made the dietitian an integrated member of the team, works with the psychiatrist, works with the counselors, works with the therapist, doing individual counseling, educational groups, improving the food and beverage, basically putting a high emphasis on nutrition as it relates to addiction recovery. There's also an eating disorder track here which looks at BED. So we're looking at the meal and snack planning, meal outings, supermarket tours, making nutrition an important part of addiction recovery. It is happening. People are doing it. The major issue now is that how do we get it to be reimbursable by insurance? And the answer is obviously we need more data. What about exercise? People ask me. Well, certainly we know that exercise is supported in the treatment of mental illness. It doesn't just transform the body, but it transforms the mind. It can rebuild brain cells that were killed by alcohol. Some of the other benefits we know, improving mood, sleep, relief from tension. But as it relates to this presentation, we're looking at how exercise can also normalize some of the hormones in the big picture. So I do state that integration of exercise along with nutrition is critical for full recovery from substance abuse. So to bring it all together, we know that food and drugs compete for overlapping reward mechanisms. That data is strong and cannot be refuted. We know that when substance abstinence has been achieved, there's likely a compensatory increased drive for food. There's oftentimes a ravenous rebound appetite due to the waking up of the hypothalamus and the reward functions that are occurring in the brain. It's likely that the obesity epidemic is related to a dysregulation in these reward hedonic mechanisms. And to bring it all together, it's possible that normalizing this disruptive leptin signaling cascade may be sufficient to decrease motivation for food reward based on that leptin-dopamine interaction. Weight gain during addiction recovery should be monitored and controlled in order to counter the associated hormonal adaptations. And this is something that I do believe that exposure to highly palatable foods should be minimized. In other words, when someone's brand new sober, just presenting for treatment, yes, there's certainly room for highly palatable processed foods, but over the course of their recovery, that should decrease over time in order to promote recovery of brain function, recovery of hormonal function, and recovery of gut function. We're also looking at this concept of obesity being in some cases a form of malnourishment where the individual eats in excess of macros, but the carbohydrates are refined sugars and refined grains. They give the brain a lot of dopaminergic reward, but not a lot of nutrients, so it tricks the brain. The protein is low and often containing excess fat. The fat's the wrong kind of fat. It's not omega-3. It's often saturated excess omega-6. So there's certainly a bunch of added calories that are empty in nutrients. And what we see is an excess of macros and a deficiency in micros. So what happens when the body doesn't have micros, it starves for nourishment. It starts screaming for food. It can't say, hey, listen, I need a little thiamine, I need a little folate, I need a little vitamin D. It just knows how to say, I need food. And when consuming highly palatable micronutrient deficient food, the brain is being tricked into thinking it's getting what it wants because it's getting dopaminergic reward. And this leads to a cycle of continuing to consume energy-dense, nutrient-void food, the body still being starving for nourishment. So bringing it all together, when looking at restoring nutritional status in drug addicts, we need to look beyond vitamins and minerals. We need to look beyond body weight. We need to look beyond the basics of calories. We need to look at improving the gut, improving brain chemistry, and improving hormones by certainly minimizing these spikes and drops in insulin. If we can keep insulin stable, we can normalize leptin, and we can prevent hyperghrelinemia. And I think that was one of the main points that I wanted to make today. Fiber is extremely important. Many people with a history of addiction have low fiber intake, so it needs to be reintroduced gradually. Having a low intake will create barriers for nutrition therapy that involves fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts, seeds, all those things that we as, or many of us as dietitians recommend. So you want to increase slowly over time. Definitely focus on improving gut health for an optimal absorption of amino acids, vitamins, and minerals. So in this ongoing battle between the homeostatic system, which is our energy balance, and the hedonic system, which is our reward, the reward system right now, it's winning. With respect to addictive drugs, educational efforts have not reduced the use and abuse. And similarly, classic nutrition education has not reduced obesity. And I'll say this with no shame, our current model is failing. We need to do something different. Although humans need food to survive, we do not need excessive amounts of hyperpalatable foods that are prevalent in contemporary diets. I certainly stand up against the food industry. I say just because the food industry makes it, it doesn't mean that it's food. We need to challenge some of this stuff. We know that craving for palatable food could be considered as a form of dopamine, opioid-related addiction, and we certainly need more research on humans as it relates to hormones. A couple rules to live by. I tell people to come back to earth, choose the least processed forms of food, Get a wide variety of fruits and vegetables. Choose lean protein. Breakfast every day, not negotiable. I encourage people to aim for all 3 nutrients every 3 hours. The mantra that I use with my patients is never hungry, never full. If you think about it, as we talked about these hormones, hunger hormones and fullness hormones, by avoiding states of hunger and avoiding states of fullness, what we can essentially do is over time normalize some of this dysfunctional hormonal and brain circuitry. Staying hydrated with water, obviously. Eating regularly is very important, providing the body with continuous energy. Eating every 2 to 4 hours to stabilize the energy, avoiding the crash, prevent cravings for sweets, prevent cravings for alcohol and drugs. Other rules to live by: when I work with people, I help them make these reductions in refined grains, sugar, salt, fat, caffeine, nicotine, gradually yet progressively. Obviously, cold turkey can lead to problems for some people. I help people get portable, bring a stacked lunch, spend extra time shopping, preparing food. I help people think of it as an act of self-care, an actual part of their recovery. Staying away from convenience stores, vending machines. When going to restaurants, learning how to order food without a bunch of additives, getting dressing, sauces on the side. These things help people in recovery. Obviously, you want to screen for the trend towards orthorexic behaviors, but for drug addicts, teaching them how to eat healthy is of paramount importance. And then to dietitians, definitely want to be a good example of a healthcare professional. There's several dimensions of wellness. We've only really looked at, physical today, but it's important to remember that all of these dimensions should be considered when developing treatment for addiction. My domain, which is the physical dimension, basically looks at food, water, exercise, sleep, sunlight, and these are all things that need to be given more emphasis in addiction treatment. So what can a dietitian do as a member of the treatment team? One of my goals is that every patient who walks into a treatment should be assessed by a dietitian who can screen for eating disorders and other dysfunctional behaviors, request labs for high-risk patients, run groups, offer individual counseling, collect data, publish findings, develop new curriculum, go on special events, supermarket tours, attend the actual treatment planning, really integrate on the staff, work with the doctors, therapists, and counselors to help patients achieve goals, facilitate nutrition and exercise interventions, audit the menu, suggest substitutions, create an improved food safety environment. Certainly want to work with the chef, which has been such a fun part of my career. I tell people that recovery is possible and that food for thought is no substitute for the real thing. It's not enough to stare up the steps. We must step up the stairs. We need action. We need dietitians who are willing to step in this direction. So I want to now open it up for questions. And let's see if there's anything that has come in to the box. Everyone. Okay. I'm looking for questions and I'm not seeing the chat box. So give me. Hi, Annie.
Hi, do you see the one question you have? I said it privately.
Okay. I see a question. Okay. I have the first question. How do you minimize exposure to highly palatable foods? They are everywhere. Through basic nutrition education. So I will certainly educate people about these topics. I will educate people about addiction. I will educate people about brain chemistry. I will educate people about sugar, salt, and fat, and about the food industry, and about some of the tactics they're using related to figuring out the bliss point, to creating highly addictive foods, to marketing to children. And then hopefully from there, people can start to make better informed decisions. It does take a while for the prefrontal cortex to heal, where people can actually weigh the pros and cons, but you're absolutely right. Highly palatable foods are everywhere. We're looking at foods that didn't used to be sweet, now they're sweet. Honey mustard bread, honey wheat. It's just it's everywhere. So what I tell people is that if you compare highly palatable foods to plain food, just unadulterated food, of course your brain is going to prefer the highly palatable food. And so it is a journey from, you know, processed food to real food, and it's definitely a process. It's not an event. It's not something that happens in one nutrition counseling session. These are the kind of things that have to happen over a course of several months. So we'll work on one thing per week. You know, for a lot of people, the first week is just switching from sweetened beverages, sugar sweetened beverages, to water, or maybe chia seeds or green tea. Just doing one or two things per week is definitely going to be helpful in minimizing exposure to highly palatable foods. I have another question about 12-step recovery programs, Overeaters Anonymous. I have certainly run into some difficulties with those programs. A lot of people get a lot of nutrition advice from their sponsor or from other people in the program, and that does create difficulties. But out of all of the 12-step programs related to food, I will say that Overeaters Anonymous is the most effective because the individual can choose their own abstinence. They're not going in there abstaining from necessarily white sugar or white flour. They can choose to abstain from eating between meals. They can abstain from eating at night. They can choose their own abstinence, which allows the dietitian to really help people craft their recovery. I see a statement that highly palatable foods are cheaper, and that's going to be certainly true, especially for people that are entering early recovery. They don't have, many people don't have a lot of resources. They've spent them all. So highly palatable foods are certainly gonna be more attractive of an option. So one of the things that I have to do is help people to learn how to shop, learn how to cook. I mean, I literally will do supermarket tours with people, and they have never, they haven't been to a supermarket in 10 years, right? So we do an aisle to aisle, and I get them excited about picking out fruits and vegetables. These are things that can make a huge difference in someone's sobriety. I have a question about disengaging personal bias from developing a nutrition care plan that is client-centered for their personal recovery. Yeah, I believe strongly that a dietitian should be trained in assessing individuals on a individual basis. So I don't think that there should ever be one idea about food, one meal plan. I think my biggest skill is being able to assess people on an individual basis. In other words, this person might need to create some space from eating desserts, whereas this person might need to eat desserts because they're at risk of developing disordered eating, right? So there really shouldn't ever be a personal bias that bleeds into nutrition counseling. The dietitian should always have the ability to assess people individually and take them down the road that they need to go. I have a question about weight loss and leptin. Is this part of why it's hard to keep the weight off? Yeah, hormones and leptin is certainly a big reason in rebound weight gaining. When someone loses weight, their leptin goes down, and so the body adapts to it. There are some quote unquote diets who where you're decreasing calories, but like on these are more in the sports nutrition world, every third or fourth day, they will have a larger caloric intake to decrease leptin from going down too low. In other words, it's called cycling, dietary cycling, where lower intake is followed by a high intake day on third or fourth day to bring the leptin back up. And this has been shown in sports nutrition data as well as in females. There is a study that looked at having a higher calorie day will prevent leptin from going down and will lead to more positive long-term weight loss outcomes. I have one last question about working with someone on removing sugar and caffeine from their diet. And the answer is that it's really something that if that's what someone needs, I'll totally support that. But it really is like a wean off. In other words, don't try to do anything too drastic with someone. It can lead to rebound binging. In other words, let's not say, okay, you're completely off. Let's say, let's change this for this. Let's change the coffee to black tea, and then go down to green tea, and then go down to white tea. Same thing with sugar. We'll do a very gradual wean off as opposed to anything drastic. Any other questions? I think we're right at the time, and that's perfect. I want to thank everyone for joining the webinar. If anyone has any additional questions, they can certainly email me. My email is at the top right corner of the slide. I'll be more than happy to continue the conversation. I'm always excited to hear about dietitians who are working in this area of the field and would certainly love to collaborate and share ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Wanted to remind everyone that by tomorrow you will receive an email from me with your CPE certificate and a copy of the slides. If you're a Nomen member, you'll also see that this will be posted within the next week. So please share with your Nomen fellow members that your experiences and encourage them to watch the recording from today. On behalf of Nomen and Angel, I want to thank you for your participation, and we hope you have a great day. And thank you very much, David, for sharing your time.
Thank you.